We move on now, and what I've suggested in the past is that both Abraham and then Jacob and Joseph found refuge in Egypt because at the time they came, they would have had foreign rulers in the Delta who were of the same general ethnic background of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that seems to explain why they were able to come. But as we read in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, after many, many years had passed, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And so this leads us now towards the coming of Moses and the Exodus. And today, the historicity of the Exodus, the historicity of the story of Joseph, are all being questioned and challenged, even by none other than our good friend Zay Hawass, who was quoted in the New York Times some years ago saying, as archaeologists, we have to say that these stories of Abraham, Joseph, and Moses never happened because there is no historical evidence. I think you can see that this is not a scientific conclusion, because I just showed you the tomb at Saqqara, discovered in 1987, of the wazir Upper El in 1987. So before 1987, does that mean he never existed historically? Only when we found him does he become a historical figure? He was a historical figure for thousands of years. We just didn't know about it. It's very different. So we can't decide something is historical when we have evidence to support it. So I disagree with the premise. Now, how do we approach this problem? We don't have direct archaeological evidence for Hebrews in Egypt, but as I showed you in the last lecture, we have lots of evidence for Semites like the Hebrews in Egypt. And this will continue. So how do we study this to determine the accuracy of the Exodus narrative? We look at the historical background. We look at the environmental picture. And unfortunately, time does not allow me to go back and look at the flood stories and the drought, the famine in Egypt, because in Joseph's day, but again, this is good Egyptian problem with the Nile. Customs and practices, religious and royal ideology, the use of Egyptian words in Exodus, very significant, and the geographical places it mentioned. In other words, do these things all fit or do they not? Now, we've already talked about this, so I'm just going to go over it very quickly. We have ample evidence from documents like the Papyrus Anastasi 6 of these foreign people coming into the land of Egypt for different reasons. Here is some evidence that I discovered in my excavations at Tel El Borg in North Sinai. A small luha, stela, and here's a drawing you can see clearly. Now this looks very Egyptian. It's written in hieroglyphs, but the man worshiping here has a name. He is a Syrian name, and the gods he's worshiping are from Syria, Reshef and Astarte, not Egyptian gods. So the foreigners brought with them their pagan gods, and they were melded into Egyptian religion. Prisoners of war were brought to Egypt throughout the New Kingdom as Egyptian pharaohs went off to fight battles in Canaan, in Syria, in Mesopotamia, in Libya, south into Sudan. Here is a picture from Karnak Temple in which we can see the Pharaoh Seti I, the father of Ramses the Great, bringing back, again, these are the Shasu Bedouin. These are North Sinai desert people. So here they are, they're brought into Egypt. What will become of them? Many of them would be put to work for the king's projects. In Egyptian wisdom literature, like the Wisdom for Mary Carre, or the Prophecy for Nefertiti, the Admonitions of Ipuwer, these are famous pieces of Egyptian literature that everybody who studies Egyptian culture and civilization will know about. And these all complain that there were foreigners coming in and living in Egypt in the Delta. And so we have evidence from literature, we have the pictures, but we also have the archaeological evidence of these foreigners, and these are some of the sites where you can see evidence of the pottery. They use different types of tombs, different types of weapons. Here's a map that will show you all the red dots where these sites are located. So all of these sites, and you'll notice they're along the branches of the Nile in the east and in the Wadi Tumilat. So the most easy access to Egypt when you come from Canaan. So very clearly, in the Wadi Tumilat alone, in this area here, 42 sites have revealed Middle Bronze Age materials from Canaan. 42 sites, not all big sites, some small. 42 sites. Middle Bronze Age would be down to 1550 BC and back to, say, 1700. 42 sites in this one area. So, clearly there were foreign people living in Egypt, and to say, well, the Hebrews could not have been one of them makes no sense when you have that many different people living. Now, I've been suggesting that the Egyptians, i.e. the Hyksos/Egyptian people, welcomed Jacob's family. They lived there for maybe a century before things turned ugly. Exodus 1:8, a new Pharaoh arises in Egypt. What does that mean? I believe that the new Pharaoh is a reference to a change in dynasty. It's not only a change in dynasty, it's a change from the Hyksos period to the New Kingdom. So roughly the Hyksos foreign rulers governed Egypt, at least the northern part of Egypt, from 1650 to 1525. Meanwhile, kings from Thebes, Luxor, in the southern part of Egypt ruled, and then around 1525 they decided they wanted to claim all of Egypt for Egyptians, and over the next years, probably for maybe 25 years, there was war from the south up into the Delta. And we have a series of kings who includes Seqenenre Tao II, Kamosa, and finally Ahmosa. There's a father, older son, younger son, and these three kings managed to finally defeat the foreign rulers and expel them. This is the mummy head of Seqenenre, and it appears that he was killed in battle. There's a hole here from an arrow. There is a broken skull from a battle axe, and here it looks like his head was hit by a large stone. So indications are he died in battle fighting against the Hyksos. There's the kind of battle axe that was Ahmosa's battle axe, and ceremonial gold knives. These are in the Cairo museums. So here is Ahmosa, the man who finally united Egypt and removed the foreign rulers. And so for the first time in over 1 century, there was one pharaoh ruling over Egypt together, rather than Egypt divided into different districts and different rulers. So I believe that what we see going on in Exodus chapter 1 represents that change between the Hyksos rule and now the rule of the 18th dynasty kings from Thebes or Luxor, Karnak. So let's read what Exodus 1 says. Then the king of Egypt said to the midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, literally the word is in Hebrew is 2 stones, if it is a son, you shall kill him. If it is a daughter, she shall live. And so we have this beginning of a program to obliterate these foreign rulers. The Pharaoh is very fearful of the Hebrews because he says, if they multiply, they will join our enemies and flee from the land. So who are the enemies they fear? It would seem that the most logical choice is that the Hyksos, who have just been driven out of power, that it would be very easy for the Hebrews to identify with this group against Egyptians. So we have this program then to limit the population of the Hebrews. Now I wanted to draw your attention to the reference to the birth stool. When the ancient Egyptian women gave birth, they actually stepped on a stone or a brick. And here is one that was actually discovered at Abydos some years ago, and it dates from 1750 to 1700. Here is a drawing of what you're seeing. A woman is holding a baby, and she's just given birth, and there are 2 women who are actually representing goddesses. But this is an actual brick that would have aided in the birth of the baby. Either the women squatted on one brick under each foot, and that's what Exodus is referring to. Not only was this important in birth, and here's another picture with the woman squatting on 2 bricks. And it's interesting, in the pictures we have, it's always 2 goddesses who help with the birth. In the Exodus story, it's 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. So very interesting. Now, in the Book of the Dead, when you go to stand before Osiris and you are judged to determine, do you get to go to heaven or do you go to hell? The deceased comes and has his heart weighed against the feather of truth, Ma'at. Now, what is important here is this, right there is a brick with a head on it. And so the idea here is that if the deceased passes the test, he is born again. And so the birthing brick, just like when the child was first born on a brick, now again the birthing brick for rebirth. So very interesting, but this little detail in the Exodus text about the 2 stones probably reflects the Egyptian birthing practice. Of course, the Bible tells us, and most memorably, of the Israelites making bricks for building projects, and they built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. And they made their lives bitter and hard in service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. So, does the picture portrayed in Exodus make sense? Does it fit New Kingdom times? We're foreigners forced to work for the Egyptian state. Exodus 1:11 through 14 identifies 2 areas where they did this: making bricks for building and agriculture. Those are the 2 main areas. Now, if we go today to the tomb of Reshmere, tomb number 100 in the Theban Necropolis in western Thebes, you can see this beautifully painted tomb. And on the walls, you have the famous scenes of brick making. We'll get in a little bit closer here. Down on the bottom, you can see water being taken out of a pool mixed to make mud, and bricks being made in a brick mold. And here's the scene continues, making bricks. Now, what you may not see, unless you are really up close, if you looked at the people, their faces, you realize they're not Egyptians. In fact, some of them, like this man here, is Nubian, is African, and this one. Some of them have yellowish hair or funny beards. These are Canaanite or Syrian. In other words, all of these the people you see working here are non-Egyptians. And right on top, I enlarged this picture here because the very faint inscription tells us that these brick makers were brought from the king's military campaigns. These are prisoners he brought back, and now they are working for the state. In this case, making bricks for a temple at Karnak. And notice you have taskmasters with sticks. Here's one here, here's one here. And notice the man is carrying a yoke over his shoulder, and the yoke is carrying loads of bricks. That's what this man is doing here. There's a beautiful verse in, I think it's Hosea chapter 11 and verse 4, where God says that Israel didn't remember that it was I who lifted the yoke from off of their shoulder. When they were enslaved making bricks in Egypt, they literally had yokes on their shoulder. Making the bricks, of course, you can see them here. The kind of brick molds are still used today to make bricks. I've seen it. Mud bricks, of course, are everywhere. Sometimes the Pharaoh would stamp the name of the Pharaoh or the temple that the brick was being used for. This is a Ramesses II brick, but most bricks do not have the names of Pharaoh on. When you think of a temple, we think of the large stones, the beautiful pillars, the large statues. This is a picture of the funeral temple of Ramesses II called the Ramesseum. And here is the main part of the temple made of stone. Much of it is missing today, but surrounding it are all these mud brick buildings. And these mud brick buildings are these are makhzans. Makhzan? Are you saying that word? Yeah. For storing. And this is what the bricks are made out of. The temple is made of stone. Exodus 1:11 tells us that they were making bricks for storage cities or storage facilities. And this is exactly what mud bricks were used for in temples, in palaces, whereas the temple or the palace would be made of stone, or the temple of stone. The mud brick was used for storage facilities. Now, if the picture portrayed in Exodus chapter 1 of this change that happens for Israel, that suddenly they are now going to be oppressed, they're going to be making bricks, they're going to work for the Pharaoh, do we have any evidence that after the Hyksos were driven away from the area, do we have evidence that the new king built in this area? And the answer is yes. Thanks to the magnetometer survey, Professor Bitak's work found two very large palaces. You can see marked by the green here. This is the palace complex. Now you can see it a little more clearly. This was an original palace that was made immediately after the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt, probably by Ahmose himself. And then a second larger palace was built beside it, and this palace would have been built maybe within 50 years. So you have two major palace programs, building programs, all made of mud brick, right in the area where the Hebrews were. And surrounding it, of course, are the magazines or makhzans around the building. And here is a artist's reconstruction. The old palace, the new palace, all with mud brick walls around it. So yes, we can say for sure that after the Hyksos were expelled and the new king comes to Egypt and he starts forcing the Hebrews to make bricks, that we know of large building projects made of bricks at this time. So it seems that the oppression begins right away after the expulsion of the Hyksos. In the area of agriculture, we also have evidence that foreigners were used in a number of areas, but we have the nicest pictures in the area of wine and grape harvest. So you can see very clearly in this colored picture, I'll have a close-up later, of all these people, black skin, African, blonde hair. These are not Egyptians, right? These are North Syrians. Same here, light-haired. Here are some more in this other scene. These men with a very strange haircut where the hair is cut way back here. Same here. Here's a closer look, but you can see this haircut with the strange beard and the yellow hair, clearly a Nubian. So it's very evident that foreigners were also pressed into agriculture here during the harvest season for grapes. One other thing we know about, you remember how Moses asked the Pharaoh to give the Hebrews 3 days to go to worship their God. And this seems like a very strange request, but it's not so strange when you realize that the Egyptian week was not 7 days. The Egyptian week was 10 days. And there was no weekend. Can you imagine? No Friday, Saturday? 10 days, and then the next 10 days, and the next 10 days, 1 month. But what you had was religious holidays. But you didn't have like day 9 and day 10 as your weekend. So the only time Egyptians had off was the religious holidays, and at the end of the year, 5 days off. Because the lunar calendar and the solar calendar are 5 days apart. So the two had to catch up. Now, this is a stone with writing on it, but it contains the records of the workers who worked in making the tombs in Wadi al-Maluk, in the Valley of the Kings. And Florence Friedman, an Egyptologist, in commenting on these, says, it is well documented that workers frequently took off to perform various religious duties. And we learn from these that so-and-so is not at work because he had been given a religious holiday. He went to worship his God. And so it's suggested, and I think it makes sense, that Moses is saying, hey, give our people 3 days to go worship our God, as your people get days off to worship their gods. And by the way, that's why no sooner the Israelites leave Egypt in Exodus 16, the first lesson God has for them is 6 days you work, 7 days you rest. Seventh day you rest. You collect manna on 6 days, seventh day you don't collect the manna. So he is reintroducing them to the creation week, which they didn't have in Egypt. So, okay. Moses in the basket. This is one of the best known stories in the Bible. And the story of a baby being put in a basket, floated in the river, has been likened to the legend of Sargon, the great Sumerian king. This goes back to 2371 BC, where he is placed in a basket, floated down the Euphrates River. And many biblical scholars in the past, or commentaries, will say that this legend somehow influenced the writing of the Moses story. It's the same idea. One German scholar, Martin Noth, stated that the Mesopotamian mark could hardly be doubted. In other words, the story from Mesopotamia from hundreds of years earlier is simply borrowed by the biblical writers and applied to Moses. It has nothing to do with truth or reality. Some years ago, when I was reading the Hebrew of this text, and it's all in one text, so it's in Exodus 2:3, when she, Moses' mother, could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it, covered it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the river's brink. All the words that I've highlighted in yellow are actually words of Egyptian origin. The word basket, the bulrushes, the pitch, the reeds, the river is actually the word for Nile, and the brink, the edge, and so on. So very strange. How do you explain, if this story is borrowed from Mesopotamia, why it has so many words of Egyptian origin in one verse. 6 words, Egyptian origin in one verse. So it tells me that this story is taking place in Egypt. It's being told from an Egyptian point of view. It has nothing to do with the Mesopotamian point of view. I know some of you probably saw the movie Pharaoh, the Prince of Egypt, about Moses being a prince of Egypt and all of this. And of course that raised the interesting question, could Moses have actually lived as a prince in Egypt, and so on and so forth? And the answer is yes. And the most likely time for that to have happened is the New Kingdom, because foreign princes in Pharaoh's courts were known during the New Kingdom. There was in the palace a school, or a small, if you will, a special place for educating and training princes, and it's called in Egyptian the Kop, the royal nursery. And a student who went to this school is very proud of this. It's like, I graduated from Oxford, I graduated from University of Cairo, or American University, Cairo, whatever. And they would call themselves a child of the nursery. And this would be on their resume of how important they were. So, beginning with the reign of Thutmosis III, and you see his dates, 1479, 1425, royal princes from Western Asia, from Syria, from Canaan, were brought to Egypt in order to be trained to take their father's positions as kings. And these princes were actually placed in the royal nursery to learn the Egyptian language, to learn Egyptian ways. And so many foreign princes were trained in this institution. Do you remember the tomb I showed you from Saqqara of the man named Aper-El? The tomb that was found in 1987? In that tomb, he tells us, I was a child of the Kop, the royal nursery. So he, as a foreign prince, was trained at the royal nursery, and then he was promoted to be the prime minister. So to think that something like that couldn't happen to Joseph, or that Moses couldn't have been a prince growing up in the royal nursery and could have had a very promising career, but he gave that up to serve God. According to Dr. Betsy Bryan from Johns Hopkins University, she says, starting in the 18th dynasty, the 15th century BC, foreign princes began to be admitted into this school. So starting, let's say, 1450, the practice of foreign princes became common. So, again, does that where Moses fits in? I think it fits very nicely. Again, I'm just reminding you of Aper-El. Okay, so there he is, Aper-El, the vizier, and also the child of the Kop. So, foreigner who was Egyptianized, and then he served for the king. Another interesting question, could Moses write? One of the things, of course, that if Moses had been raised in the Kop, or the royal nursery, he would have learned how to write, for sure. Like other foreign princes, he was probably bilingual. That is, he was learning Egyptian and whatever his spoken language, because then he'd be useful to the king for international communication, to speak with ambassadors, things like that. Now, another important thing is when we think of the Hebrew script, the language the Torah was written in, we have the earliest evidence of the type of writing of the ancient Canaanite script was found in Egypt. So the Proto-Canaanite script already existed 100 years before the times of Moses, and we have to go into Sinai to Serebit el-Kadem. Let me just back up. Serebit el-Kadem is here, and those are the mountains of Serebit. This is where the Egyptians went to mine turquoise, Pharaoh, for jewelry. It was very important for Egyptians. And in the caves where they mined for the turquoise, it's clear that along with Egyptians were Canaanites or Canaanite-speaking miners, and they left inscriptions on the cave wall. Here you can see. And this one is interesting because it reads, just like Hebrew, El Olam, God the everlasting. And El Olam is one of the names that we read of God in the story about Abraham. El Olam, God the eternal one. So here you have an alphabetic script, Canaanite, which would be very similar to Hebrew, and this dates somewhere around 1800 BC. So in other words, hundreds of years before Moses, the alphabetic script that Moses could have used was already invented. This is very important. And so here we have another example of this alphabetic script, in this case, written on a piece of pottery. This was found in Israel, but it actually has the letters written in alphabetical order, A, B, C, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, etc. So this dates to the 12th century, and so we find this script is being used among the early Israelites in the land of Canaan. So it's probably the same script that Moses would have used maybe 100, 200 years early to write the Ten Commandments, to write the laws, and so on. But as we will see a little bit later on, I think tomorrow, one of the great contributions of Egypt to the history of writing is that the script that the Canaanites and the Hebrews used was basically derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs. So they actually derived the writing system from Egyptian and turned it into an alphabetic script. So a very important development in the history of writing took place here in Egypt, and Western civilization is the beneficiary of this development.